Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to see if I can perform a magic trick, which is by speaking to make our speakers appear. And voila. Try that again. I'm still working. Hey, look at that. That's incredible. Wow. Good afternoon. We happy few. All of us here who are on a Friday afternoon in Phoenix, middle of February, beautiful weather outside. You know that if you're here, you are really committed to this conference right now. I thank you all for being here, and I extend a very special welcome to our two guests visiting or zooming in remotely. I will introduce them here in just a moment. Today's fifth panel, our final panel, is on designing utopia, ethical, political, and religious guidance. Now, I'd like to alert you that I don't think that this is guidance as in a how-to guide to design a utopia. This will be a question mark of what kinds of considerations might we want to think about in addressing the many questions we've been raising about utopia and utopian thinking. There is perhaps no form of social and political thought that is easier to embrace and at the same time to dismiss than utopianism. For those inclined to extol its virtues, what makes them sure that utopia is the right language to address the problems on which we all know are great and many, that need to be addressed. What makes utopianism the right way to go about doing this? But we might also ask, particularly of critics, is the readiness to discount utopianism as warranted as the critics maintain? I think much will depend on what we mean by utopianism or utopia. What goals, what visions, what methods, desires does that term conjure up? For whom or for what end? What purpose does utopian thinking exist? And should we make distinctions between utopian aspirations, the intellectual enterprise of thinking through, hypothesizing, imagining a better world, and the actual efforts to realize them? This panel today is going to engage these and many other questions through consideration of how different philosophical, religious, moral, and other intellectual traditions, what they might have to say about this pursuit of utopia and its dangers. This will be a bit of a more far-ranging, a more humanistic approach, rather than looking at some of the very specific technological questions that we've considered earlier today, at least in the previous two panels. In the course of this conversation, I would also like to invite reflection on some of the ideas, the virtues, the values, the terms that are often associated with utopia. One thinks here about hope, about progress, about idealism, optimism, whether it's excessive or cautious optimism, of escapism. It seems to me that utopia contains components of all of these things, and yet might also be something distinct from these. In any case, this suggests that in a setting such as this, we would invite the panelists to say a few words about what they mean or think about when they talk about utopia. This is, of course, following the old guidance of one of my advisors: define your terms so you're not talking past each other. So to lead us in this conversation today and to try to begin addressing some of these questions, we have four brilliant minds, along with your less than brilliant moderator, who can share insights from their research, from their own experiences, from their wisdom. And I'm going to introduce them now and get them started. Sylvia Chrostowska is a professor in the graduate program in social and political thought at York University of Toronto. Her work spans modern political and critical social theory, especially the Frankfurt School, history and genres of discourse, from political philosophy to literary criticism, cultural memory and effect, nostalgia, and for our purposes today, utopianism. Her most recent book is Utopia in the Age of Survival Between Myth and Politics, published recently by Stanford University Press. The Very Reverend Ian Markham is Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary and an ordained Episcopal minister. Trained as a Christian ethicist and biblical scholar, he is the author and editor of numerous books, including Against Atheism, Why Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris Are Fundamentally Wrong. I wonder what the thesis of that argument is. And Why Do Morals Matter? A Guide to Contemporary Religious Ethics. I also think I might know the answer to that question. So, his interest in religious ethics overlap with his broader comparative work and interfaith engagement, including questions about truth and tolerance. And I've long looked forward to the opportunity to engage with Reverend Markham here on many issues. We've contributed to some works together, but have not had the chance to engage face to face. Someday in person, we'll have you out here in Phoenix too. And they are joined today by two faculty members here at ASU. To my far left, Paul Carrese, who is founding director of the School of Civic Economic Thought and Leadership, where he also teaches courses on comparative, political, and religious philosophy. He is a key investigator on a major national study on improving American history and civics education in K-12 schools, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the U.S. Department of Education. His most recent book is Democracy in Moderation, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Sustainable Liberalism. And finally, to my immediate left, Ben Hurlbut, Associate Professor of Biology and Society in ASU School of Life Sciences. He is Director of the Initiative on Technology, Science, and Human Identity, a key investigator in our Beyond Secularization project, and part of our Religion, Science, and Technology Collaboratory at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. He is co-director of the Global Observatory on Genome Editing and a multi-university initiative based at Harvard. He is an expert in bioethics, biomedicine, and the history of politics and science, and he has a new book coming out in a few months, right? Called Experiments in Democracy, Human Embryo Research, and the Politics of Bioethics. Oh, a few years ago. That's what I said. It came out a few years ago. I said, okay, thank you. Maybe the paperback, maybe there's another edition coming out. Okay, all right.
Yes, that's right, the paperback.
The paperback is coming out in a few months. See, I do my homework. Okay, all right. Okay, so the way this format's going to run today is I'm going to invite our keynote panelists who are zooming in to, or hoovering in, I guess is the appropriate term here. I have to watch the copyrights. And to say, to sort of lay out some initial positions, I'm going to begin with Professor Chrostowska. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Yes, I am. Great, good. And then Reverend Markham there. And after this, I'm going to go to first names now. And I'm gonna tee things up with a couple of preliminary questions. And then, depending on how the conversation goes, I may do a few follow-ups here and there, and then bring Ben and Paul into the conversation as well. So, beginning with you, Sylvia, I'd like to ask each of you to speak to a general question of, the question of the day. What do you see as the perils and the possibilities of utopian thinking? Why, in short, would we want to nurture utopian tendencies or discourage them? And I'd like, if you would, for each of you to say a few words about the intellectual traditions that you're coming from as you formulate these thoughts. How is it that they inform your views? And then finally, why now? Why are these questions that we ought to be thinking about either spurring on some utopian aspirations or perhaps being more wary of them, restraining them, given the kinds of challenges that we face today? So, Professor Chrostowska, over to you.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to join you. I'm unhappy that I can't be there in person. I've never been to Arizona, so this would have been a great opportunity. But alas, we'll see. Whenever this is over, I will, I'm sure, make the trip. And I've prepared some remarks that I will essentially read as is my habit, but they are not very dense, and so I hope that everyone will be able to follow as though I were speaking. So to the first question, I will start with possibility, and which you evoke, the possibility of utopian thinking. And so at the outset, I should make clear that for me, utopian thinking is about imagining the possible and the desirable. Some have also described utopianism as social dreaming, a definition that I like very much. So dreaming, the social dreaming, is envisioning desirable possibilities as real. Often these dreamt of possibilities might seem to the majority, for one reason or another, to be impossibilities. This is especially true of possibilities whose realization would endanger the habits and livelihoods of many and threaten the status quo. But, and this is important, utopianism does not inexorably lead to the political or technological realization, partial or otherwise, of the possibilities it considers valuable, desirable, or even worth pursuing. Utopianism does not even necessarily entail attempts to realize such desirable social possibilities. To ignore this fact is to forget about much of utopian social theory from the last century and a half, notably German sociology and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. People like Weber, who in politics as vocation repeatedly says that we repeatedly must reach for what is impossible. And that impossible is also, as I will say, a kind of possibility. And people like Karl Mannheim and Marxists like Ernst Bloch already mentioned, and Walter Benjamin, and post-Marxists like Theodor Adorno. These would be forgotten essentially if we ignored this fact that utopianism, utopian thinking, does not lead to realization, to attempts to realize utopia. But we can focus our imagination, so our social dreaming, on possibilities that we discover as being latent in the present, because that way we take guidance from history on what could be done. But we needn't limit ourselves to such latent possibilities, historically latent possibilities. We can be as wild as we want. So utopian thinking occurs within the realm of the possible, but and that is within the realm of human possibility, but it's not easy to determine what is and isn't possible, right? So I include within utopian imagination, social dreaming, Charles Fourier's fabulous utopian evolutionary vision, for instance, or popular myths like the land of Cocaine, medieval imaginary, where nature provides for all without requiring any labor to access its bounty. That's not to say that I consider either of these visions as possible in the sense of realizable, feasible, workable, not to mention expected. I insist that they are possible in the sense that I recognize that what is and isn't possible is simply not fixed, but relative and changes over time. And there's also an important distinction to be made between relative and absolute impossibility. Yeah, so now when we say, well, there's the possible and then there must be some impossibility. Well, of course, something may appear impossible now, but be considerably attainable later with effort and belief that is usually based on faith in some technological advancement. Most commonly for us, the indefinite extension of life or the elimination of death altogether, right? Immortality, and the elimination of all evil from the world. That is perhaps less on our agenda these days. But still, this may appear conceivable, attainable later with some effort. Engineering. I would also insist on a distinction between the impossible and the not impossible. The latter term acknowledges our ignorance about the possibilities or the potentials in the present. The category of the not impossible leaves room for an agnosticism of sorts. So now for the perils. The only peril that I see is to utopian thinking, not of utopian thinking as such. Let's remember that utopianism has emerged chastened, humiliated from the staggering accumulated failures of its projects, like the perverted, failed utopian experiments in society building that were Soviet Union or Maoist China, or even Cuba, North Korea. So utopianism has been cut down to size by the wave of dystopian thinking that, as a result of these failed experiments, had washed over the 20th century, the latter half, and the first, and even the first half as well, and the first decades of the present century. And of course, Aldous Huxley, whom we celebrate today, had contributed enormously to that current, to that cold shower for utopianism. We are not in danger of putting a utopian plan into practice. And so much intellectual and political energy these days is spent on damage control and scrambling for resources and upgrading existing natural and man-made support systems to ensure basic survival for millions, if not billions of people. In my pessimism-leaning view, we have neither the human resources nor the epistemic and technological tools to realize utopia on a world scale, something that people believed to be possible 60 years ago, for instance, 50 years ago. The same cannot be said for dystopia. But despite the defeat of practicable utopias and our current lack of world utopian means, we continue wrongly, I think, to see utopianism as a slippery slope. And if we do so, we miss out on the opportunities to imagine a possible better future for ourselves and for future generations. Northrop Frye, the Canadian critic, wrote that the utopian literary imagination is less concerned with achieving ends than with visualizing possibilities. And this is the view that I take. And by not allowing ourselves to imagine the qualitatively better possible, we doom utopian thinking. In fact, utopia is possibility, and more precisely, the possibility of a significantly better form of society that has not yet been put into practice. And in my book, I stress that the existence of utopia is possible, or at least that we should think of utopia as being possible, and that on a global scale, that is, everyone's invited. Technology has unified us to the point that the creation of an isolated utopia or an utopian archipelago would not only be unjust, but also untenable, insofar as it would either depend on the exploitation of the outside or unsuccessfully ignore the misery existing beyond its own borders. It would be a society conscious of its own isolation, of having cut itself off from reality, which would be a source of permanent doubt and ultimately of a corrupting unhappiness and social disintegration. And so I have some ideas for how to prevent this peril to utopianism. I will leave that for later. I will pass on to move on to speak to the second question that you posed, and that is the intellectual traditions. And I will be very brief here. I would say that in the 20th century, there are two cultural movements that have informed my thinking recently on the subject of utopia, and those are surrealism, which continued beyond its 1969 sort of formal dissolution, continues to this day. But of course, the moment that interests me most is from the 1924, the beginning, to the 1960s, when it was historically recognized as existing. And the second is the social theory of the Situationist International, another French movement that existed between 57 and 72, and was very strong around, again, 1968. And both of them had radical aims that went from wanting to abolish art as a separate domain by merging it with life, to more expansive and more concrete interventions in everyday life that could transform the mundane individual and collective existence in urban spaces, for instance, into a magical utopian one. So these to me work and complementary moves in 20th century thought culture. And the other intellectual current, I would say, it falls under what I call iconoclastic utopianism, and it could be traced back to as far as Marx. But especially I see it in the Frankfurt School, and especially its main exponent, that is Theodor Adorno. So it is a current that that has fed into my idea of utopianism as essentially radically iconoclastic, if it is to help us, to help guide us, and not to remain a kind of imagination that we associate with perfection, with a fixed end to which we gradually asymptotically advance, approach. But of course, without itself changing at all. So that is not that is why I insist on the iconoclasm. And finally, your question about why now, and I will just say that I see the situation today as, of course, as everyone, rather dire. And I think utopianism has a lot to offer in terms precisely of the practice of imagination. And I stress, as many do when it comes to the urgency of climate action, that it's now or never. It's utopia or bust. Utopianism is a kind of ultimatum. But it's also a large, in this situation, in our decade, when we have become much more conscious of the gravity of the problems, it's largely a matter of survival. That is, it's there to ensure survival and also go beyond survival, of course. But the first sort of necessity of utopianism is survival, and that, in other words, the only steps that many would consider utopian under the present. Only steps that many would consider utopian under present circumstances could save us from catastrophe. So it would be things like general demilitarization, nuclear disarmament. These are aspects of a utopian future that we consider utopian, but were not so utopian some time ago. It's just that now, given the general disaster we are living, they do again. So we should not just avoid the slow catastrophe, but take the opportunity to fix things that have long been broken. And that is this opportunity that I see now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, for getting us started. Really thoughtful questions there. Having read some of your work, I can appreciate deeply, and having been part of this conference for the last 2 days, I can appreciate deeply the intense intellectual work one has to do to defend utopianism, as you're seeking to do here. And I think these are excellent remarks to get us started and to get us thinking, and I'm looking forward to hearing Ian's response. Before I turn to Ian, could I ask, you made a note of a point of noting that utopian thinking can be pragmatic, it can be realistic, and can be useful. Are you able to offer us, and you offered a circumstance about where we might go to from in our current moment. Is there a historical point or an example from the past in which utopian thinking was proven to be useful?
This is a question for me.
Yes.
When utopian thinking has proven to be useful, well, I think it's proven to be
some illustration of its success, maybe.
I think, well, one example that we've celebrated some of us celebrated last year was the Paris Commune. So that was an example of utopian thinking in the sense at work, in practice. It was a moment in French history which was very much nourished by a whole movement that called Fourierism, Charles Fourier already mentioned, which was extremely influential also in North America, and in terms of people coming over to North America, establishing Fourierist colonies, intentional communities, utopian communities, in other words, trying to put these ideas into practice. And of course, the criticism is always that they failed, and that the Paris Commune was ended in of course a bloodbath. But these are still important to us as myths, and this is something I did not yet speak about. Maybe we'll have a chance to do later on. But when we try to maintain utopia as a kind of practice, whether pragmatic or more on the fantastic side, we need to go back to these myths and reactivate them. And not only do we need to, but we actually do. So that would be the Paris Commune for the French, for instance.
Great, thank you very much. As I turn things over to Ian, I want to just make a special invitation to members of our audience to enter your questions into Whova. We will track them here and share them as our conversation continues. So over to you, Ian. Ian, over to you. We've got a little bit of lag, it looks like. Either that or he is very pensive right now.
Of internet connection.
Just a little bit. Okay. So yes, I think we're good.
Okay,
if you get into a jam, you can also just try shutting your video off. We'll understand.
Thank you. So let me just start by saying I've thoroughly enjoyed today, and I'm delighted to be with you. And I feel very privileged to be with such a distinguished set of panelists. And your lineup over the course of these sessions has just been outstanding. And I've learned so much. And what I've really appreciated are all those specialists who actually know where the digital world's going to go. And, you know, I mean, it's been really an extraordinary feast. So thank you very much for this invitation. So just in terms, let's start with possibilities. So in terms of my intellectual traditions, I'm going to start with the Anglican ethical tradition and pick a very obscure Oxford professor, V.A. Demant, who had this bright idea that a good analogy can be drawn between the individual and society. And his idea, and this of course has been echoed in more depth by others like Jung, his idea put very simply in the same sense that a person has a conscious life and a subconscious life, so society has a conscious life and a subconscious life. And I think what's interesting about utopian and dystopian views of the world is that they actually sort of provide a vehicle for people to understand the deep insecurities, anxieties that people have with the present, because of course the word literally means no place. It's I'm frustrated with this place, and therefore another place is what I aspire to or I fear. I mean, Huxley, of course, was writing at a time when he said, look, the messiness of liberal democracies is infinitely preferable to Nazism and fascism. And so he creates this dystopia of order in an obscenity. I mean, even Thomas More, you know, he was worried about crime and disorder, and so he creates his island utopia. And Bellamy, you know, he was worried about industrialization in the 19th century, and so he creates this Back to the Future model of complete order. And so you can go on. It's like the psyche and the subconscious of society is revealed through our utopian and dystopian expectations. And I think that is true. I think it often, they're like psychiatrists, utopian literature, and they sort of speak to our inner fears and anxieties. And I do see a lot of the utopian and dystopian, and you know, you can see a continuum all the way through to conspiracy theories, QAnon, and you know, Jesus Christ married Mary Magdalene and disappeared off to the south of France. You know, it's all there's a sort of journey as we go into the psyche of our social living and organization and our fears and insecurities about how we're ordered. Another intellectual influence is Jurgen Maltman, and that's where I think positively of utopian visions, and this is where I agree with my co-panelist, and whose work incidentally I admire deeply. You know, I do think that they do provide a standard that challenges the status quo. And that's Jurgen Maltman's analysis of the whole language of the kingdom of God in the Christian tradition. You know, the Magnificat of Mary, envisaging a society where the poor are lifted up and the rich are brought down. It's an appropriate standard by which we judge our age, and it's a standard to which we slowly work. But turning to the perils, this is where I'm influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr and Christian realism. And of course, Niebuhr had his season as a Marxist, and then in the 50s and 60s decided that it was too problematic, this sort of utopian vision of a social order. And that's because in the end, human lives are very complicated. Often utopian visions come with a sort of intolerance that can be deeply destructive. And any attempt to actually implement that vision, you know, can often lead to significant damage and bloodshed. So on the possibility side, I see that utopian and dystopian language speaks to our inner social dispositions, and more positively can provide a standard for the way we think about the present. On the negative side, once we start trying to implement a utopia, then such programs can often be repressive and authoritarian. So that's where I sort of stand on this discourse.
Ian, if I could ask you a follow-up question. You invoked Reinhold Niebuhr, and I was thinking a little bit about his famous language of the impossible possibility, or is it possible impossibility? I can't ever remember which it is. But the idea here that you need some kind of standard that is both real, conceivable, has value, and yet is somehow never fully attainable. And it struck me is that for all of Niebuhr's criticisms of utopians and idealists and for not being quote unquote realistic, there is a kind of parity between what Sylvia was talking about the sort of the function that this ideal serves, whether it's the kingdom of God that is never fully realizable on earth, or whether it's the heavenly city or whatever it might be. I wondered if you wanted to say a few words on that.
Yes, I think that the standard functions on the assumption that it won't ever be realized. So in other words, it's a standard that challenges us to recognize that the status quo is incomplete and inadequate and can be improved. But in Niebuhr, you know, the Sermon on the Mount, for example, and the pacifism and judge not lest ye be judged. I mean, you know, he had that sort of reformed conviction that in the end, if you tried to implement that, you know, as a political program, then you are in danger of not having judges, and criminals would go free, and there would be no legitimate force to bring about peace, which is important given the fallen nature of the world. So, you know, Niebuhr had this sort of balance between recognize the standard, but recognize we make compromises from that standard all the time, which are right and appropriate, but never rest content with those compromises. Always seek to interrogate the place you're in to make sure that you're not just being sinful in compromising needlessly. So that's my read of Reinhold Niebuhr. He sort of recognizes that there is a standard, but you need to constantly interrogate. You need to recognize that it is a standard that's probably unattainable, given the whole host of other factors, but nevertheless, you've got to be in conversation with it all the time.
One other thought on this, as Sylvia was describing this, the kind of the imperative of utopian thinking right now with climate change, it struck me that the goal ultimately that she offers is survival, which does not seem utopian to me at all. If one is thinking about having overly lofty aspirations, the aspiration for mere survival is relatively modest in the Niebuhrian sense of the term. Would you agree?
I certainly think survival is a good, yes, and I think an appropriate way to, I mean, you know, but exactly what's a utopian vision which will bring about survival is the question, of course. You know, because the interesting thing is most of us are still driving gas cars. So what's going on there? You know, are we just being hypocritical? Are we just being sinful? Are we recognizing that we aspire to drive an electric car, but just at the minute we can't? I mean, so in other words, what exactly is going to be the vision that will enable survival in respect to climate change and carbon emissions? And, you know, and of course you do have a spectrum. I mean, Elizabeth Colbert's mischievous book, Under a White Sky, you know, you can either become low growth, green, you know, radically simplify our lives, potentially reduce population, you know, that could be one way you go, or you blast diamonds into the sky, sounds like the Beatles, and pack carbon emissions in big storage units under the ground. I mean, so in other words, what exactly is the way to get to survival and what's the vision you need? And I think where Niebuhr would be is that, sure, we need to survive, but don't assume that one particular route's the only way to get there.
Yeah, last question. I'm going to turn things over to our, my colleagues here. Sylvia offered some examples from 20th century of utopianism gone wrong, pretty well-known examples in terms of communist experiments, things that Karl Popper had written about and has come up earlier today. But in some of your more recent work, you've also talked about the problems of utopian thinking in U.S. foreign policy. I wondered if you wanted to share a little bit about where you think we've seen utopianism go wrong in, say, in the 21st century here.
I mean, I'm sympathetic to John Gray's thesis in Black Mass that, you know, any sort of overarching narrative that imagines an end that becomes the sole focus of any policy can be deeply destructive. And I do think that the neoconservative vision of a democratic, pluralist Middle East made possible by the invasion of Iraq was utopian in the sense that, you know, it was a goal that didn't take seriously the Sunni Shiite divide. It was a goal that didn't take seriously the sheer logistics of it. It was a goal that didn't take seriously the complexity and history of the region. It was a goal that didn't take seriously that, you know, after the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, a lot of these states were European creations carved up by the British and the French. You know, there was a whole host of things going on there, which is where, you know, I want to counsel, sure, have a vision, but make sure it's in conversation with the reality on the ground.
Great, thank you very much. Again, to our audience members, please feel free to enter some questions into the Whova app. We'll get to them shortly. I'm going to turn things over to Paul Carrese to offer a little bit of commentary here and engage our panelists.
Thank you, John. Thanks to the conference organizers, and thank you, both of our speakers. I wanted to pose a question that is more on the cautionary side that I think Ian mentioned. And it has to do with the power of technology, material technology. So to take Sylvia's terms, to think from the end of the 19th century, the Paris Commune, through the 20th century and into the 21st century, don't we have enough experience now with utopian thinking and the material possibilities now open to it that were not open to Plato or Thomas More or to any earlier thinkers? So whatever value utopian speculation, imagining might have had prior to this last, let's say 100 years, 150 years, don't we have enough experience now to know that if utopianism doesn't entail wide-scale social disaster, it probably will, if pursued toward some systematic conception of transformation, social transformation. And I'll add the recent panel to move beyond, authoritarian material technologies from the 20th century, but to the metaverse, the capacities for digital technology, electrical digital transformation, not just in authoritarian hands, but as a kind of a neutron bomb going off in our own liberal democratic social orders, in which younger people live on and by and die because of they're subsumed by screens. So isn't the game changer here the extraordinary power of technology, which is likely to have unintended consequences if that's coupled, as it would almost necessarily be, with utopian imaginings.
Sylvia, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Of course, technology is a challenge to dreaming. And I, a few years ago, wrote a dystopian novella in which I played around with this horrible scenario, which everyone will be living in a kind of metaverse most of the time, and otherwise will be working. So I'm under no illusion that that time is taken away from us to dream socially, to imagine, and it is work, imagining society differently. Yeah, imagining society better and differently is an effort of the imagination that is we are outsourcing to the designers of technology, to designers of virtual realities, virtual worlds, with Feely's in Huxley's Brave New World. So of course, I have no answer as to what will happen, how far this will go. Maybe there will be a return to a kind of Luddite action on in a lot wider scale, and maybe this will be a way of expressing the need for social dreaming. But I don't think that will ever disappear unless we become complete automatons. But I don't think that's where technology will take everyone. In any case, maybe most people, but not everyone. So there will always be those who then might have to be sent off to an island for the independently minded renegades, as they are in Brave New World, or something like that.
Ian, would you like to comment?
It's a great question, and I'm inclined to agree with Sylvia. I mean, I think that, the Christian conviction is that everything can be used for good and bad. We're made in the image of God, and therefore, we can use something for good, and simultaneously we're fallen, and therefore we can use things for bad. And the truth about technology is that it is both a good and bad tool. It's good in the sense that I've got an English accent and I can play Wordle with my siblings and share results in an instant. And it's bad in the sense that everybody's a news provider, and conspiracy theories and hatred and bullying and can sort of accelerate in moments. And I do think that it is complicating our moments significantly, because everybody's got now two identities. You've got your sort of present identity, in the 3 dimensions, and you've simultaneously got your cyber identity. And what's interesting is that the cyber identity, strangely and rather unwisely, imagines it can be secret. And therefore people do all sorts of extraordinary things. They write things they would never say in front of a person. They're abusive. They carry on complex secret lives. They do all sorts of things that they find a stranger to become a friend, to enact a depraved fantasy. I mean, so they do all sorts of things. And I think you're right to say that what's interesting about our moment is the sheer percentage of time that people are living on screens, and the cyber identities more present than the present identity. And I do think that that is a shift that we've not yet absorbed its social implications of. And in terms of utopia, I think one thing we're all learning is that technology will only ever be a tool. It'll never be the destination. And in actual fact, you know, the sort of cyber realities that we're being invited to join in need to be carefully analyzed. And one needs to learn the skill set of navigating it with some wisdom. I mean, it's so weird. If you look at the literature when television appeared, you know, and the hysteria in the church and how people feel it would destroy the family dinner, and you know, people just spend hours in front of this goggle box. I mean, that was nothing compared to the metaverse, or with the fact that every single person carries a massive computer around with them that has the capacity to tell you everything and be a medium to communicate anything to everybody. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I think we're still absorbing the implications of all that. And I don't see technology being part of a utopian solution to our present ills. I think it's going to be a tool that we'll have to navigate and handle, but it's not going to ever be the destination.
Ben, over to you.
So thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. And actually, the last two comments you made, I found both of those, each of your comments, very interesting. And I want to ask my question in a way that that I think challenges a little bit some of what you have both just said. So first of all, Ian, in a sense, your response to Paul's question was a response about, let's call it, we could say the public sphere or something like that, but let's call it the spaces, let's call it the spaces inhabited by thought, by discourse, and in effect, actually, Sylvia, by dreaming. And you said, Sylvia, that technology is a challenge to dreaming. And I think I would disagree with that quite fundamentally, in the sense that, yes, true. At the same time, it is a modality of dreaming. It is a medium of dreaming. In fact, if one looks to technology as a sort of defining dimension of modernity, and in particular of political modernity, it is a space of dreaming in which forms of life, potential, desirable, good, have been given articulation, sometimes in material form. So in that sense, it is a materialization of dreaming, but not necessarily, because of course the technological is a space of meaning making, a space of imagination, and a space of the sort of articulation of a posture towards the future, where the future is, understood in a kind of progressive sense. So therefore, it becomes a space of adopting postures towards the good. And so I wanted, your comments on survival caused me to think of a little bit of text that I want to make reference to, okay? Because I think that this is an articulation of a form of hope and a sense of urgency and the kind of politics associated with it that is coming to be defining, and perhaps rightly so. And yet at the same time, it seems to me we should be cautious about it. So this is a bit of text from the Brundtland Report, which was, its official title was Our Common Future. It is this sort of ur-text of sustainability, of sustainable development, of the vision of a kind of global political future that the circumstances of global environmental risk/disaster demand. And this is from sort of deep in the bowels of the appendix of the report. And it's begins with a very anodyne statement. The concept of sustainable development provides a framework for the integration of environmental policies and development strategies. The term development being used here in the broadest sense. The word is often taken to refer to the processes of economic and social change in the third world, but the integration of environment and development is required in all countries, rich and poor. There's a kind of imagination of the whole, of the collective, of the we, well, a reimagination of the we, that is on the one hand modest, practical, urgent, and at the same time utopian, right? But a kind of incipient utopianism that is at the same time, it's unifying, it articulates a kind of imperative, but it's a totality. It is a homogenizing, it is a reductionist, it is a de-differentiating imagination of the we. And this comes just a little bit ahead of a little box in which they include a quotation from a person who spoke at one of their sort of public hearings or whatever. And this is an indigenous person from the Amazon. And so the person says this: "You talk very little about life. You talk too much about survival. It is very important to remember that when the possibilities for life are over, the possibilities for survival start. And there are peoples here in Brazil, especially in the Amazon region, who still live. And these peoples that still live don't want to reach down to the level of survival." So my question is this. I mean, if you draw upon those repertoires of utopianism that you have pointed to, that, it seemed to me are virtuous insofar as they invite us to imagine a politics that brings us out of the deficiencies of the present and so forth. But the element of what you called iconoclastic utopianism, and I think what I would simply call critique, slip away from it, then there's a sense in which the kind of politics that one needs in order for utopianism to be a virtuous political enterprise fades away. And in my view, it becomes dangerous. Dangerous because, in the project of the preservation of life, it may in effect be reduced to survival. The project of sustainable development is, in my view, a kind of reductionist project. And what that then becomes is a project of dreaming technologically and of materializing those technological dreams in modes that in effect render the world in the image of that dreamt of good. And so to come back to the sort of public sphere point, to the sort of spaces of collective imagination point, it seems to me that the worry ought to be less about the idioms in which we dream, utopian or otherwise, and more about let's just call it the political institutional environments within which we constitute the conditions of possibility for dreaming, and the ways in which we seek to place limits upon the kinds of constraints that one might impose upon dreaming, lest those dreams materialize themselves into forms of domination. And so I wonder if you would say something about that and what relationship that bears to the kind of problem or project of utopianism. And furthermore, what you see as the role of critique in that, because to me, critique is a utopian project insofar as it dreams not so much of a best place, but of the no place in which critique would not be necessary, and therefore emphasizes to us in the here and now the absolute necessity of it, lest we sort of slide into a kind of reduction of life into bare life, in effect, into mere survival or some other sort of iteration of it.
I'm not sure if you want me to respond first or Ian.
Sylvia, why don't you go ahead first?
Okay. Yeah, these are extremely interesting comments, remarks, Ben. So I thank you for them. And of course, I would just like to clarify that I don't see all technology as threatening. Of course, as you rightly say, technology has been very important in unleashing the utopian imaginary, in aiding it, in mediating it, and making it more widely available for consumption. So of course, the technological means that that Benjamin, for instance, writes about in the Arcades project, they are means of dreaming by a society that is, of course, a consumerist society. And these dreams are utopian. They are not just content with what is, but with transcending what is. So the two are not opposed, and society can certainly, technology can certainly help us enormously. But it is a question here, I think, of an excess of technology, and a technology that is so sophisticated that it enslaves us. It controls our entire environment, our built environment, and so it is a kind of totalitarian grip, that cage in which we are gradually sinking, advancing. So that is I think the question of technology is an important one, and it is not a challenge to technology. It is not a challenge to rather to social dreaming in general. It is just, in my view, a challenge to the time, the leisure time, not to be connected to a device and engaged in something that prevents us from thinking independently. If that can still be, if we can still hold on to this idea of thinking independently, I'm not sure that this would stand up under philosophical scrutiny, but I do want to hold on to it. And critique, you say that iconoclasm is, to you, sounds like critique, and of course you can say critical utopianism, but I want to emphasize, by saying iconoclasm, I want to emphasize the a kind of alertness, awareness of the moment when utopias tip over into idolatry, into worship of these images that we set up, and become fixed rather than, closed, rather than open-ended, the way that I would want things to be in this iconoclastic utopian practice, where the individual utopias are all subject to very ruthless critique, and the process continues nonetheless of imagining. So of course critique is absolutely central to it, but utopias being images, I found that a more evocative term to precisely intercept the idolatry that so many have pointed out is a danger when it comes to utopian thinking, entailing also projects and realization, right? And you've evoked this danger yourself. And lastly, survival. The passages you read, of course, I see that there is a danger here in being in reducing life to the preservation of life, that is to say, to survival. But what I try to do is, and this also by way of clarification, is not to just remain with survival and be content with surviving. It's simply, to me, a matter of working with the need to survive. It's a given. We need to spend more time in our daily lives thinking about how we're going to survive from day to day, economically, environmentally, etc. So it is to see in survival a resource, and a utopian resource specifically. That is the combination. That is the relationship I want to establish in calling for kind of utopian imaginary from within a moment where survival is at stake, and the condition of survival is generalized.
Ian, would you like to comment?
There's much that I agree with that's just been shared with you. I mean, so I think, let me stress, everything can be good and bad, right? And technology can be a good and is a good in a whole host of ways. I have two worries about it. Firstly, I have a commitment to presence and proximity as an intrinsic good. So I would much prefer to be in Arizona with you all and to be able to just relax over a meal and talk further about the questions we've started analyzing than to be on an unreliable internet connection from a hotel room. So that's number one. And then the second is that, of course, the weird thing about the original vision, and this was highlighted in earlier panels, and it was spot on. You know, everybody imagined it'd be a highly democratic environment where, you know, it would be self-regulating because somebody says something and a million other people would counter it. But that isn't what's happening. You know, Google and Facebook and these entities are large and controlling and manipulative, and they facilitate mechanisms of advertising that have hitherto been unimagined, you know, where my IP address is collected, and before I know where I am, I'm having the opportunity to buy my wife jewelry while I'm looking at the weather. So it's just not ended up being benign. And as a result, it's much more complicated. But I'm certainly not a Luddite, and I do think that technology, but I do see it as a vehicle, not a destination. And I do think that this is just a little aside, but all the studies around health and human flourishing have shown that turning up to church every week adds, if you do it from 20 onwards, 7 years to your life. It's a huge factor in longevity. Now, why? And the interesting thing is not what you believe. So you can be, you know, skeptical, or you can be a fundamentalist. It's presence. Okay, that's the sweet, and it's better than other forms of social organization, which is really puzzling. So what exactly is going on? I do think presence and proximity are needed to be human. We just need to occasionally be with somebody, you know. And I think one consequence of COVID is that we've learned how damaging lack of human connectivity is. We're living with that reverberating out now for a decade or so.
I'd like to raise a question. Well, actually, we just now have a question from the audience, so I will defer my question for just a moment while I bring that in. Okay, so here is a question from Misty. Is the world of web more totalizing and immersive than earlier worlds of radio or the movies? We presume, I want to question this presumption, at least as a heuristic.
John, that's my question.
Oh, very good.
So,
And I'm, yep.
While the presumption is that it's more totalizing, and of course it's interactive, that's fundamentally different. But when we think of the effect the movies, for instance, have on popular culture, on society, adulation of celebrities, fostering imitation, furthering fantasy worlds, causing disruption. And much the way Ian said about television, and that's well stated because Newton Minow famously called it a wasteland. The movies were never called a wasteland, they were beloved. We even elected a president who was a movie star. Woe is me. Right? We elected a governor who was a movie star. So
we elected a president who was a television star for reality TV. So, yeah.
No, I'm just limiting it to the movies because the movies were a technological phenomenon that was as totalizing as the web and generated the profits and the audiences the web's generated. During World War II, the movies were the principal way, the movie theaters were the principal way Americans learned about the war.
That's right, yeah.
The Trinity explosion was reenacted for the purposes of a movie theater film. So I wonder if, as much as, you know, Gaiman is beloved in his absence, Ben is beloved in his presence. Nevertheless, I question Ben's presumption that this colonizing of our dreams hasn't already happened and happened before the web, and that there may be
I didn't
some
suggest it hadn't.
qualitative differences between the totalizing immersion of the web, as the York professor says, but the character of the colonization of our aspirations.
Sylvia,
Is, I think, we can make an equation. And when I say heuristic, I mean, even if I'm historically wrong, even if we cannot make this comparison, I think it's useful to presume that these new technological systems are not entirely novel, that we have, that is part, by the way, of the ideology of the internet people, is that this is totally new, you've never seen it before. But in fact, we've seen a lot of these things before, and even in my own lifetime. And there are, I dare say, people in this room older than me who've seen even, it's not new, but it's dressed up as different.
so I'm judging from the smiles I'm seeing on screen that you were able to hear Greg even without a microphone. Who would have thought?
His voice travels across the globe.
Okay, I want to. It is a question that's put forward for the panels. Or is it a question for Ben specifically? Okay, all right. So and
it was in support of the
yeah,
two Zoom speakers.
yeah. Ian and Sylvia, anything you want to weigh in on this? And I'll give Ben a few minutes to say something.
I mean, you know, it is undoubtedly true that the human history has been shaped by significant epochs and developments. I mean, you know, the development of the printing press was defining for the Reformation, the Renaissance, you know, and so you can go on right on, you know, the telephone and movies, for sure, you know, a huge dramatic effect. I do think, though, there's a leap in intensity, and the big difference is the sheer percentage of time. You know, in the end, you went to the movies once a week, and you used to have that extraordinary experience and live with it, and it developed your fantasy life, and you know, and you fell in love with movie stars, and it informed you about other parts of the world and changed your perception of geography, and it was huge. But it was once a week. Now people are spending 50% of their waking hours in worlds other than the local and the immediate and the present. And that is a difference. And the impact of that difference is still, I think, to be absorbed by us all.
So my heuristic part is simply to say, perhaps there were some lessons from how we adopted and adapted and influenced our construction of the experience of the movies or radio or television. Perhaps there were some lessons that are applicable today if we would dredge them up, that we're really not on totally new ground, is what I'm saying.
I agree with that. I do think that revisiting these seasons of huge, significant social change and analyzing exactly how society adapted and absorb those changes would be a really interesting exercise and a worthy Templeton grant.
Can I make one plug on why I still think the differences are worth accenting here? You noted the sheer amount of time people are spending in this new technological medium. It's also the participatory nature of it. It's not passive reception of news, of entertainment, which in essence are things that unite people because you're all consuming the same things. So it's partly the participatory nature of it. It's also partly the social divisive nature of it, which one is participating in, and it divides people. The internet creates spaces for all sorts of extremes, all sorts of places where you wouldn't be on the margins in the way that movies help create what comes to be understood as consensus. So, Sylvia, anything we'd like to add to this conversation?
No, I agree with Ian entirely that the local, the presence is extremely important, and of course, I also see that we have technology that has taken a qualitative leap. or either our relationship to technology has taken a qualitative leap. And so it is, as you say, immersive, and it colonizes our consciousness and subconscious more and more. And so it is something that that we need to be, and we are thinking of disciplining, of controlling on some level, of educating our desire, an expression I like very much, not through moralism, but through seeing what, taking stock of our needs and of our desires, while we still can reflect on those needs and desires. Because of course the strategies of addiction that come with technology are making us into slaves of it. And this critique of technology as essentially mediating all social relationships, as specifically images mediating social relationships, is what the Situationists, to whom I'll come back, had called the society of the spectacle. So these are theories to be revisited, and they were very they are good for our time. They are powerful enough. They pack such a punch that I think they are very much timely today, even more so than, and they will have even more of an echo today or in the future, tomorrow.
I'd like to ask, being a theological ethicist myself, a somewhat theological question that begins with the observation that you're each drawing from very different kinds of intellectual traditions. One, I think we could say, is broadly secular, the other being quite explicitly religious and theological in Ian's case. There are a number of points of convergence between I think, where you ultimately end up. But on questions of utopia, potential perils and considerations and potential possibilities. But I'd like to maybe close by thinking a little bit about the importance of, or what import the idea of a heavenly city, a heavenly utopia might play in your thinking. And as you think about a term that is very much associated with utopianism, which is hope. And it seems to me that whether one calls it the kingdom of God or the heavenly city, that there is a role that plays in thinking about what's possible here on earth, as you mentioned, Ian, and also for thinking about what is what we ought to be striving for or hopeful for. And I hope I'm not misparaphrasing you, Sylvia, but there was a moment in which, in one of your writings, I think you mentioned something about the denigration of hope by monotheistic traditions. And I think that might be an interesting point to explore very briefly here before we wrap up. Either one of you who would like to start. Ian, do you want to go first there?
I'll happily go first. I mean, I think, I am committed to the view that God is, and that God is a player and agent in the world in which God's made. And I am also of the view that embodied in the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, he both brought the kingdom and invites us to anticipate in the work of building the kingdom, hence thy kingdom come in the Lord's Prayer. And I do think the Christian hope is that there will be society so ordered that love and justice will triumph. And that although ultimately God will bring that about, we're also invited to do the work between the two comings of trying to incrementally bring that about as agents of God in this world. So for me, this is a metaphysical claim grounded in my conviction that God is. And of course, the standard line in the utopia literature is that for a long time, God was the agent to bring about a better world. And then Thomas More gets the credit for imagining, humans becoming the agent to bring about a better world. Now, actually, Sylvia sort of challenges that sort of picture in her work, but I would also want to challenge it, because I do want to say that, you know, and here you'll hear echoes of process theologians, although I wouldn't identify with that school, but there's echoes. Namely, I do think that God invites us to do the work of God about bringing about a world that's better, and that the vision, the Christian hope of a world of the Magnificat, of Luke's gospel, we're playing through it in the lectionary. It's such hard work every Sunday, because it's a constant challenge to the status quo. And that vision is something that we're supposed to be incrementally working towards. So I do think that we are invited with God to do the work of making the world different. And that's part of what a commitment to the Christian hope involves.
Thank you. Sylvia, you're going to get the last word today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm definitely for hope, and I'm not. I guess I want to oppose hope to solutionism, because we hear a lot about resilience these days, how we should be resilient as societies, and of course, that that presupposes that, you know, we work together, we have this is a social virtue. You know, we kind of grin and bear it and rebound from every catastrophe, from the coming even greater catastrophe, etc. And we essentially accept living in survival mode, which is not what I, of course, want. But resilience, to me, is on the order of finding solutions to just sort of rebound and you know, wipe the dust off, and so hope is something for me that is much spiritually richer, and I think we should hold on to that. And you know, it's hope for survival, but survival as in my sense of something that is connected inherently to transcending the condition of survival, to dreaming of a better future, of a utopian dreaming, a social dreaming. So not sort of restricted to the individual and the survival of the individual, but a kind of a broader social survival. And so hope, to me, is very much a part of that that aspiration. In terms of the kingdom of God, and I would say that it is part of our collection of myths that can be a way of imagining utopias. It is, as other myths, myths of progress, myths of apocalypse, the myth of classless society or stateless society. These are myths that we can reactivate, combine in a very pluralistic fashion, but without accepting among them myths that are repressive, myths that are against life, as in something that we can work to improving in the here and now, in the future, rather than resigning ourselves to accepting suffering and to hoping for salvation, rather than hoping for that salvation in the here and now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us virtually, and to my colleagues on stage here. And go ahead, Sylvia. Yes.
I just wanted to thank all of you for your absolutely wonderful comments and the discussion. It's really been an enormous pleasure. And I you know, it is 1 a.m. sorry, where I am, so I'm a bit tired, but it's been really great listening to everything.
Well, extra thanks and commendations to you then for joining us at this late hour. If there are no, do we have any final comments? We're going to. We have a final comment. So I'd like to thank again our audience for joining us for this panel, and all of our audience here and virtually, and as well as in person online. And I'm going to turn things over to Barry to offer some final comments here.
All right, well, first of all, I think we really should give our panelists a round of applause for a stimulating discussion, and interestingly, one that ends with hope. I mean, when I first thought about and we first began discussing, I was worried that these would be grim discussions. There might have been some dark aspects over the past 24 hours as we've gone through this session. But we end with a way of looking at utopia as dreams and a way to envision how our world might change without being ossified into something that becomes tyrannical in itself. I want to thank all of the people who made this meeting possible. First of all, those who were brave and chose to attend an in-person meeting again, so I certainly am thankful of that. I am very appreciative of the online audience, that numbers in the hundreds, I'm told, and so that's a terrific thing. Another aspect and the nice thing about this meeting is that we will be hopefully soon, within the next few weeks certainly, putting the videos up on the web. I know I need to go back and look at some of them again because there was some just powerful statements made in the course of the sessions that we've had. And so if you'll keep your eye on the the Center for Study in Religion and Conflict website, the CORES section, you should see those pop up soon. If you find this type of conversation stimulating and useful and hopefully thought-provoking to the extent that it makes you want to act in some way, I hope you'd consider financially supporting the work that we do and making a contribution to the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict to promote the CORES videos. Once again, thanks for coming. I don't see her. I was going to have Misty come up, but one of our key logistic people has been Misty Faulkner. And so even though I don't see her, we want to thank her, and I think they're trying to track her down, but I'm sure she's solving a problem someplace. And so, oh, Misty, come up here, please. It would be simply wrong not to recognize the Herculean, I can't come up with a female, but the incredible efforts that Misty has made. And so please thank her for all that she's done. And we hope to have another CORES event sometime within the next 6 months or so. And so keep posted on that. And thanks once again for your participation. Misty's going to remind me of something here, and why don't we cut out the middleman?
For our virtual attendees, thank you so much for being with us all day. We do have a virtual networking tables that we'll be launching in just a moment. So if you want to join those tables to talk about your favorite sessions and maybe the big questions you still have. So please join us for that. And thank you so much for joining us for CORES 2022.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye.